Hello there, Drew Hanisch, Whiskey Lore, and this may very well be the second most exciting tasting I have ever done. And I say the second most exciting because the most exciting tasting I ever did was the precursor to this, which was me going all the way out to California and getting a chance to sample the Leonis collection. There were 19 pre-prohibition whiskeys / brandies that were contained within these jugs called carboys or demijohns, and we did a chemical analysis on these to make sure that they were okay because they weren't really labeled very clearly. And so we had the chemical analysis done and then went through and tasted in one sitting 19 pre-prohibition whiskeys. All of them were probably 45% alcohol and up, and most of them were on the upper range. And let me tell you, that was quite an event, and one that was a little hard to stand up after. I never in my life would have thought I'd have an opportunity to drink all of that whiskey, and it was just absolutely incredible. If you want to hear the story, you can go find the Whiskey Lore podcast, and I tell the story in season 4, episode 10 and 11. And I'll tell more about these bottles as well and how I acquired these bottles. But I wanted to take this opportunity not only to do a tasting of these whiskeys, but also give you a sense of the history of these bottles of whiskey and how they're all, except for one, tied together in some way. Now, that's what may kind of surprise you because these names may not seem like there's a connection between them. The only one that doesn't have a connection is this bottle right here, which is Green River. Now, this is what's really cool about this. This is Green River Distillery from Owensboro, Kentucky. And when this bottle was made, there was a Green River Distillery. Then it changed names several times, had some time when it was mothballed, became O.Z. Tyler, was part of the Kentucky Bourbon Trail, and just recently they decided to go back to their old branding, and it is Green River again. Now, if you want to see how old this is, this was bottled in the spring of 1916, and it was distilled in 1910. There was not a war to end all wars yet. William Howard Taft was the president, taking over for Teddy Roosevelt. That is how old that bottle of whiskey is. Now, that is the only whiskey I am not going to taste. I don't know if I'm going to open that bottle or not. Something you will notice about that bottle is that there is a lot of it missing. Okay, and yet it is still sealed with a tax stamp. How is that? Well, unfortunately, cork tends to be porous enough that think about it, that was bottled 105 years ago. So it's had 105 years to evaporate, and so it has. But all the other whiskeys on this table are all related in one way or another, and I'm going to walk you through the history, even though I do so in a Whiskey Lore podcast episode as well, because I'm going to actually go a little beyond that and tie in some things that I probably wasn't as specific about in regards to these particular whiskeys. So season 3, episodes 1 and 2, I go all into the history of Old Crow, Dr. James C. Crow, the man who, it's been claimed, came up with the sour mash process, although he didn't, and all of that is answered in there. But he was working at the old Oscar Pepper Distillery and working for Oscar Pepper in the 1830s, and he continued working there all the way into the 1850s. Now, there's not a lot of specifics written about Dr. Crow. I don't know of a biography, if there is one out there, And all of the distilleries that are associated with this story, I will tell you straight out, I'm giving you some general dates on this, but there was no registration of distilleries at the time when a lot of these were changing hands. And so because of that, there weren't great records kept. And so it is hard to know exactly when one distillery started and when one ended, and so on and so forth. And when somebody worked there and when they didn't work there. And the time thread between all of these, except for Green River, is Colonel E.H. Taylor. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through all of this stuff. I'm going to do the tasting, and what's really cool about this tasting is that I was gifted these bottles by the law firm that was handling the estate for the Leonis collection, and Karina Flores is the paralegal who got all of this stuff worked out for me, and who gifted me these wonderful bottles of whiskey. And we were sending some emails back and forth the other day, and there's something very unique about that bottle of Hermitage that we were talking about. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could do a comparison with another Hermitage whiskey? I actually found an article where somebody tasted a bottle of old Hermitage whiskey that was made in a different way than this. So I'll get into that once we jump in and do the tasting. But first, let's get a little bit into the history of these distilleries and how they're all related. So Oscar Pepper, Old Oscar Pepper Distillery, which today is Woodford Reserve, that distillery is where Dr. James C. Crowe was working. Now, what happened is that he died maybe giving his recipe out or maybe not giving his recipe out, but he did have an assistant, and that assistant, William Mitchell, I think was his name, took that and continued on at Old Oscar Pepper. They also made an Old Oscar Pepper whiskey as well. These were two very popular whiskeys, and that's why you hear them connected with a lot of different famous people. And so what happened was, at some point, it's thought that Dr. Crowe left, but that the name stayed at the Old Oscar Pepper Distillery. Now, just after the Civil War, Oscar Pepper passed away, and when he did, he had a son that was 7 years old that was supposed to take over the distillery, not anticipating that Oscar Pepper was going to die so soon. And Preston O'Bannon was his name, and he passed away also. So next in line would have been James E. Pepper, and you may know that name because there is a distillery now called James E. Pepper, and he was Oscar Pepper's son, and he worked at that distillery as far as we can tell, but his mother decided when Oscar died that she needed help from somebody who knew what they were doing. So she reached out to a firm called Gaines, Berry and Company, and that and company was Colonel E.H. Taylor. There were three founders, and he was one of the founders of the Gaines, Berry and Company. And so in comes Nancy, or Nanny, she was her nickname. She brings this company in. They're running this thing through the late 1860s. And Colonel E.H. Taylor has somehow ended up becoming the guardian of James E. Pepper. Well, something gets strained here along the way, or maybe Colonel Taylor finds a better opportunity, because now he's going off to work at, to go to the Old Fire Copper Distillery, which today you would know as Buffalo Trace. So he goes off to work there. But before he left, he apparently had influence on the Gaines, Berry and Company developing a new distillery down the road from Woodford Reserve on the banks of Glens Creek. And not sure whether it had an official name at that point or not, but it's what became the Old Crow Distillery. which still exists but sits in ruin behind the Glens Creek Distillery. So this distillery has really fuzzy dates around it as to when it was built and what was produced there. There is a thought that they were making Hermitage Whiskey as the first whiskey in that distillery because the Old Crow was still being made over at Old Oscar Pepper. So James E. Pepper decides to sue his mother with the help of Colonel Taylor to gain control of Old Oscar Pepper Distillery. When he gained control of that distillery, the name Old Crow left and went to what became the Old Crow Distillery. So what happened to Hermitage? Well, they built another distillery. Not sure on any of the dates on this stuff, and it's possible that Hermitage moved out early. It could be that Hermitage actually never was made at this Old Crow Distillery. Very, very hard to tell from the records that are around. But they built this distillery called the Hermitage Distillery right on the Kentucky River, within eyesight of the state capitol. So this is basically where Hermitage comes into the story. So then they're producing the whiskey over there at the Hermitage Distillery. Colonel Taylor is working at Old Fire Copper. There becomes a point where things become strained there, and so Colonel Taylor decides to run off and start the Old Taylor Distillery, which exists today still. It is Castle and Key Distillery. It looks like a Scottish castle, and it was done that way on purpose. He wanted it to be a showplace. And so this bottle of whiskey right here was made in that very distillery. And you'll see here, this is Old Taylor, and has a picture of the distillery there, and Colonel Taylor over here, not with his fancy black top hat like you tend to see him. He was quite the dapper dresser and showman. E.H. Taylor Jr. and Sons, and it tells you that it was distilled in Woodford County, and the offices were in Frankfurt. So 8 fluid ounces, bottled in bond. This does not say, it says a straight Kentucky whiskey of topmost class. And if we look at the top of this, you'll see that I have broken into this one already. You'll see on the back is you have your little warning back here, which is basically saying, it's talking about the Bottled in Bond Act and why there's a seal on this bottle. And Colonel E.H. Taylor is the reason, one of the main reasons for the Bottled in Bond Act. He fought for that in Washington. And so very cool to see that on there. And then look at the date on that. So this is a very interesting date on this particular whiskey because it's only a 4-year-old whiskey, which we're used to for bottled in bond. It's a requirement that it age for 4 years and it'd be 100 proof. But as you can see by the Hermitage, that one was aged 9 years. So you can go beyond the 4 years, and most of them did at that time. So why did they not go that long with this one? And my thought is that being that this was bottled in the spring of 1917, right on the edge of Prohibition in Kentucky, they were probably trying to get out as much whiskey as they could. Something else that's interesting about this bottle is that a lot of whiskeys coming up after this would say for medicinal use or medicinal purposes. But there was no need to do that on this bottle because we hadn't quite gotten to that part of Prohibition. What's really cool about this bottle is it actually has a glass top. And that glass top was surrounded by a cork, which you can see now as corks don't do well over a long period of time. And in fact, when we talk about the Hermitage, I'm going to point out exactly, what happens with a cork. All right, I'm pouring this. You can see there's not a lot left. I actually shared this with some great people, and I'll tell you that story here in just a moment. Think about that. Think about this liquid that is coming out of here. That was stuck in this bottle 104 years ago, and today I am pouring it past the cork into that glass, and there's just enough left to have one more sip. Okay, now I poured this one early, and the reason I poured this one a little bit early is because this one was aged 9 years, and the theory is that for every year in the glass, or in the bottle, it should, or every year in the cask, it should spend 1 minute in your glass. All right, I'm going to tell you the fun story of this. You'll see that there's another bottle right behind it, and it's actually this bottle that I took on a extra journey. But you'll see how beat up that bottle is, and actually you'll notice also at the top I have a weird looking cork in there. That's actually a cork from a Shackleton bottle of whiskey. The cork broke while we were doing our little ceremony that I'm going to tell you about, and unfortunately it got all in there, and I ended up having to strain the cork out of it. Anyway, this is Hermitage Whiskey. You will see that spring of 1914 is when it was made, and it was bottled in the spring of 1923, right in the middle of Prohibition. You have your nice little bottled in bond warning on the back, aged 9 years. Now, what makes this whiskey extremely interesting is that unlike this whiskey, which traveled all the way out to California in the 1910s in the bottle, in a crate, this whiskey was actually shipped in a barrel by train all the way across the country. Now, we talk about whiskeys like Jefferson's Ocean at Sea and the Cayo and all those different whiskeys that and Madeira, and how you put them on boats to let them rock around and really get an extra push into that barrel. Well, imagine being on a 19th century, early 20th century train coming across the country. I can imagine that this whiskey rocked quite a bit before it finally got to California. Now, the mystery to this initially was, wait a second, Hermitage is a Kentucky whiskey. And so my assumption is that they bottled this in Kentucky. But what they did with this particular whiskey, it says, bottled in bond from barrels marked Hermitage Whiskey. So very unique to any other Hermitage whiskey you may find if you find an old dusty bottle from this time period, because this particular bottle, actually, the barrel itself was aged in California in a bonded warehouse for 9 years, meaning that it didn't get Kentucky's extreme weather changes. This one got a much more mild fluctuation in weather in Southern California, and it also spent time on a train on the way out. So the question that Karina had for me was, do you think you'd ever be able to find a bottle of Hermitage whiskey that was Kentucky 100% from that time period and be able to do a taste test, one to the other, to see what the differences are? And I said, oh man, the chances of that happening, pretty small. Well, I was doing a little research, and I looked up and I found the website, The Whiskey Jug, which you may have run across from time to time if you're looking up tasting notes for different whiskeys. And lo and behold, they had a bottle that was, I think it was bottled in 1926 and was a 10-year. So 1916 to 1926 for that particular whiskey. And so I scribbled down all of their tasting notes. I had already done my tasting notes on the whiskey the other day. And then I saw their tasting notes and I went, oh man, I get to compare these two. So I'm going to do that. I'll tell you what the Kentucky only whiskey was like, and then I will tell you what I'll do the tasting on this particular one as well. All right, so we're going to start with this Old Taylor. You will see color-wise, it's actually just a hair lighter than this one. And I'm guessing, well, first of all, this was only aged 4 years. That was aged 9 years, and that spent a lot of time rocking around in a boxcar. So that probably has something to do with it. Now, this one, amazingly to me, was not very heavy with the legs. And so yeah, it's hard to know what to expect when you're going to be, nosing and tasting a whiskey that is from a completely different era. So this has a really nice fragrance that jumps out of the glass. It's burning the nostrils just a hair with the alcohol, but it doesn't smell like alcohol. It just has a nice slight bit of wood, oak. It has you'd be surprised. It actually reminds me of bourbon in a lot of ways. I say that, it is bourbon. I say that because it's not, there's not some weird thing coming out of this glass. Like, wow, where the heck did that come from? And, this is an alien planet. This is still bourbon. It's just bourbon that's been sitting in a bottle and oxidizing a bit over time. But you get the vanilla, you get a little musty smell from the wood. A little nuttiness to it. And you get a little bit of youth alcohol on the nose. All right. Oh, and it has an old warehouse kind of smell to it. No real vanilla standing out on it. Trying to see if there's a spice or something that I could pull out of there. It's not grassy, it's not herbally, it's not floral. No, it's it's got a nice slight fragrance to it maybe that is a little bit of vanilla, probably more butterscotch. I think there's more butterscotch coming out of that. Yeah, more butterscotch. There's where it's different. It's very thin. It actually goes away really quickly, and it leaves a bit of alcohol and that kind of musty oak on the finish. But I can't describe, it gets really nice at the end. It's almost like it goes through a little bit of youth before it hits that finish, and then it's just really nice and clean, and I'm feeling the nice warm feeling in my chest on that one. But it has a very unique flavor to it. It's not, I can't compare that to anything. I have to taste it again. A little spicy, a lot, for something aged for just 4 years versus some of the older, more oaky whiskeys. That oak is really there, actually. It's pleasant tasting. It's young and it's old at the same time. It's really interesting. I hate to say that it doesn't. There's nothing about it, I think, that makes me, that if I drank this, I would say, oh man, that's a 100-year-old whiskey. That's very There's a little mint on the end. It's got a kind of a fresh feel to it. But it's hard to distinguish the flavors in the middle, and I've got my palate back, so I should be picking some of that stuff out. Something reminds me of almost like a saltine cracker kind of thing going on there. It does have what seems to be almost like a little salt characteristic to it. It's really, really interesting. It's just a pleasant drinking whiskey, a little thin. Does not remind me of a traditional bourbon. It's a little bit more subtle. It's not overly sweet. The vanilla and caramel don't really jump out at you. And I remember we took these out and did our first tastings on them. And I sort of remember having kind of that feeling like, I was almost expecting, man, revelation kind of thing. And I don't want to play it down. It is, and I definitely have a lot of reverence for that bottle and all it's been through to get here. But I would say the one takeaway from that is just that minty, fresh smell and taste that I kind of get out of that whiskey that lingers and is really, really nice. Nice little aftertaste that goes on with that one, but very clean. You do sense the alcohol a little bit, but no flavors really overly punching you in the face on that particular whiskey. Now, the story with that whiskey and with the Hermitage is that after these were in California for 98 to 104 years, I drove to California 3,000 miles, picked them up, and drove them back by way of Kentucky. And we went to Colonel E.H. Taylor's gravesite, and we opened that bottle of Old Taylor there and poured a glass and toasted Colonel E.H. Taylor. What's really cool about that, on top of it, this is at Frankfort Cemetery, is that his gravesite is overlooking the Kentucky River. And when you look across the Kentucky River, you see the state capitol, you see the bend in the river, and right there is where the Hermitage Distillery was. So, time to jump into the Hermitage whiskey. Now, this one I got a lot more out of. This one is really nutty on the nose. I mean, as soon as you pull this to your nose, that wood is right there. Got a little bit of that. Ooh, the vanilla. If you inhale mouth and nose at the exact same time, equal strength, the vanilla comes into your mouth and into your nose. Okay, so this is 9 years, bottled in bond, 50% alcohol, same as the one the whiskey jug had. So I got a bit of caramel in there. There's a nice little mint. I don't know what these guys were doing when they were making their whiskey back then, but for some reason I've gotten mint out of both of these. This one has a very fragrant smell to it. And the way I put it was just to say kind of a perfumey, fragrant, it's all coming from the oak, I think. And it's a nutty, fragrant, maybe a little baby powder kind of a smell that comes in there. And there's a little hint of alcohol in there, but not much. So in their notes, they basically said the same thing about the one that was made in Kentucky, except they got more butterscotch. But they got the musty oak also. And they got citrus on the nose, and I'm not getting citrus on the nose. All right, so cheers. this has a flavor I have never tasted in another whiskey. And I know whiskeys have this flavor, but seriously, this tastes like a cola nut. It tastes like you are drinking. It's like you're having a whiskey and a Coke, but you don't have a Coke. And it is so out front. It is like cola to the ends of the earth. It dominates the entire palate on this whiskey. It is fascinating. I've never tasted that much, let alone tasted really cola in a whiskey. And this one, it just is right there in your face. You can probably see the legs on that. Oh my God, is that a rich whiskey? I mean, it is heavy on the palate, creamy. There's a little mustiness in there, but man, I was reaching to see if I could find the citrus. These are some of the flavors that, again, they talked about. The citrus, the butterscotch, the musty oak. I get a little of the musty oak, but honestly, the cola just dominates the crap out of this whiskey. That is really most of what you're tasting in here. It's really, really fascinating. Okay, there's a little bit of, it's like citrus peel. It's like an orange peel is what it is. And it kind of comes in on the finish. And there's an herbaliness about this, but man, that is a fascinating, fascinating whiskey. So the other things I'm getting on the finish, I get a little tannin from the oak, but it's not offensive. It's not overly bitter. It's just kind of like a, hello, I'm there. I've been in an oak barrel. Cherry and dark chocolate I get on that finish. And my favorite is that you, after drinking your cola, you get a fresh Andes mint. You know, those dark chocolate mints with or a peppermint patty. It just has this really nice, fresh mintiness that comes right back out on the finish. It is amazing. Now, they said in theirs that they had oak, mint, and spice. So they're probably picking up some of that same mint, but they did not get the cola. And I would have a hard time believing that they couldn't pull cola out of this. The cola does linger into the finish just a bit. But holy cow, I mean, whereas, and maybe that's the extra 5 years, maybe it's just, what they're using, the mash bill at the distillery or what, but holy cow, man, world of difference between the two. That Hermitage is an impressive and really fascinating whiskey. All right, so that's it for that part of the tasting. You'll see that there is one other bottle and one glass here. This, because I got that, I had some trading capital and I ended up getting a bottle of something I have wanted to taste forever. If you follow whiskey lore, you know that the passion project for me is Old Crow. And that's why I did a couple episodes on it and told the story of James C. Crow and why I went on and also went and interviewed David Meyer over at Glens Creek and did all the research to try to figure out where Old Crow was made and its whole lineage. And why Old Crow now is basically a watered down version of Jim Beam White Label. Because in the 19th century, Old Crow and Old Oscar Pepper were premium whiskeys. What happened? Well, even in the 1950s, the 40s and 50s, Old Crow was still a well-revered whiskey. Then somewhere in the 1960s, and I talk about it in the episode, something went wrong. And when it went wrong, it went way wrong. And it was so bad that when Jim Beam took the whiskey over, they dumped the old formula and decided just to start afresh with their Jim Beam White Label. And so that's what it is now. So what's in this bottle? I had to trade a little bit of Hermitage for. This is 1947 Old Crow. And I'm going to do a tasting on this, but this is one of those cases where I'm going to do this tasting for the Whiskey Lore Society. So if you are a member of the Whiskey Lore Society, watch for the video coming up sometime in the next couple of days. I will do the tasting on this, and if you want to become a member of the Whiskey Lore Society, you help fund the travels I do and the writing. There's a lot of work that goes in, and I'm a one-man show, and so it takes a lot of time for me to write, produce, and basically promote these episodes. And then all the travel I do on top of that also costs a lot of money, and all that comes out of my own pocket. So I set up a Patreon, patreon.com/whiskey-lore, and or you can go to whiskey-lore.com/society and get there as well for as little as $5 a month, and that helps me out big time. But I will do a tasting video on that Old Crow, and I will post it for the Whiskey Lore Society. So I hope you enjoyed this video presentation. If you want to learn more about these whiskeys, then make sure, and the story of how I got them, make sure to go out and check out season 4, the final 2 episodes, and also for more on Old Crow, we're going to go back to season 3, episode 1 and 2, and then you'll find a whole bunch of other episodes in there about Uncle Nearest and George Washington's distillery and so on and so forth. I cover Scotch, I cover bourbon, I cover, I love history, so I dive in deep on history as well. All I can say, folks, is that this has been an experience, and I hope you enjoyed this and that you learned something. And man, you can find a bottle of this. Man, yeah, this is the one. All right, until next time, cheers, Slàinte mhath.